How are you guys doing? Today is Tuesday, August 3rd, 2021. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm not only going to do an elite profile, but I'm going to do a GOAT profile on Tom Brady. The GOATed starting quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers turns 44 today, and my intention with this episode is to try to go through all the accolades, the achievements, and just to show what he's been able to accomplish from the moment that he hit the limelight as a college football quarterback at Michigan to show where he is right now, as he is literally one of the few players walking the earth that can call himself a one-man dynasty virtually. This man won 6 championships with one of the most historic franchises of all time. He won all the championships that they've won as their starting quarterback. He went to join a completely different team in Florida, and in his very first season there, he brought them to the Super Bowl. So his impact is virtually unmatched, and I mean, many people know him as the man, the myth, the legend, Tom Brady. So if you're not familiar with him, he stands at about 6'4". He's 225 pounds. The best way I would describe his game is that he doesn't have bad plays. He's very smart. He's of course he's one of the players that Bruce Arians gave complete coaching control to, and in his very first season where he called a majority of the plays in the playoffs, he has not given his teams any reason to not give him complete control over the offense, because Tom Brady outsmarts defenses to the point where it doesn't even look like they're professional football players. And this is a guy that many people are joking like, oh, he doesn't have the athleticism of other quarterbacks. But the fact that he doesn't lose, especially in big games, should be a big testament as to what his impact level is, what his skill level is, and the fact that he's more than just an elite player, but a GOATed one. So, of course, his story starts in Northern California, where he was eventually recruited to go play at the University of Michigan. He would go and play in 1996. That would be his first season. That was Lloyd Carr's second season there. Lloyd Carr was in Michigan from 1995 to 2007. In Tom Brady's very first season of playing there, his freshman year, he would go on to complete 3 of his 5 attempts for 26 yards in a season where Michigan would eventually lose in the Outback Bowl as the 20th ranked team. They lost to Alabama that year. Following that year, Tom Brady would come back for his sophomore year there. He would complete 12 of his 15 passes for a total of 103 yards, as he was still fighting for playing time and still wasn't known as the Tom Brady that he would be known as yet. Eventually, he would come back for his junior season at Michigan. In his junior season, he would complete about 62% of his passes, throwing for 2,400 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 10 interceptions. In the 1998 season, where they would eventually finish 10-3, and they would win the Florida Citrus Bowl as the 12th ranked team, finishing behind Arkansas. Not to mention that in his second season there, they did beat Washington State in the Rose Bowl game to end up as the number 1 team in the AP poll. But in his first year as a starter, like I said, they'd still be a winning team, as Tom Brady wouldn't do anything particularly special. He will come back for his senior season in 1999, where he completed 61% of his passes for 2,200 yards, throwing for 16 touchdowns and 6 interceptions in a season where the Michigan Wolverines would finish with the 5th best record in the nation. They beat Alabama in the Orange Bowl, and they still finished as the number 5 team in the nation. Following his 4-year career at Michigan, Tom Brady would establish himself as a good enough prospect to be taken with the 199th overall pick from the 2000 draft. Many people, I guess he's very famous for that, taken with a 6th round pick. Of course, if a player were taken in the 6th round pick right now, you wouldn't really expect much of them. But of course, Tom Brady was able to make lemons out of lemonade, which is probably one of the grossest understatements of all time, in order to really make a name for himself in the NFL as someone that didn't even make a name for himself in college. His very first season in New England would be his age 23 season. And in that year, he'd only play one game in a season where the New England Patriots would finish with a 5-11 record in Bill Belichick's first ever year coaching. Yes, they did come in. Tom Brady did come during Bill Belichick's first season, but he was playing under Drew Bledsoe, wouldn't really get his opportunity to play. And in 2000, he would, and that would be the only season in which he wasn't the starter of an NFL team, except for 2008. But other than that, he would, ever since he came into the NFL, he would basically be on fire. He would be a fire that the rest of the league would not be able to put out. In his very first full season with the New England Patriots in 2001, in his age 24 season, Tom Brady would start 14 of the 15 games that he played in a season where the Patriots would finish with an 11-5 record. In his very first season as a starter, the Patriots would win their division and make it all the way to the playoffs. In that regular season, he would complete 64% of his passes, throwing for 2,800 yards, 18 touchdowns, and 12 picks, all on his way to lead New England to the playoffs. And in his very first season as a starter, he would be named a Pro Bowler in his very first starting season. Once the Patriots made the playoffs, they would have beat the Raiders in overtime off of a tuck call, but that was his very first playoff game. They would beat the Steelers in the AFC Championship the very next game, and then they would end up beating the greatest show on turf, the St. Louis Rams at the time. And in his very first season as a starter, Tom Brady would go down as a Super Bowl champion. And of course, he had an amazing team at his disposal, but he was the player that eventually had to break through, and that was his very first Super Bowl championship after his very first season as a starter. After already cementing his impact in the league, he would come back for year two in his age 25 season. In that season, he would start all 16 of the games that he would play in a season where the Patriots would finish with a 9-7 record and completely miss the playoffs with the second best record in the division. Tom Brady would complete 62% of his passes, throwing for 3,764 yards, 900 more yards than he had thrown the year before. He threw for 28 touchdowns and 14 picks. His 28 touchdowns they led the NFL. He led the NFL in touchdown passes for the first time in his career that year. And even though they missed the playoffs, many people were starting to see Tom Brady as a threat, as one of the young players that eventually could that could leave an impact virtually on the game. And this was following his first season in which he won the Super Bowl MVP in his first year as a starter. After the year in which he missed the playoffs, he would come back to New England for his third full season. In his third full season with the Patriots in his age 26 season in 2003, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Patriots would go 14-2 and win the AFC East for the second time in his 3 years, in that 3-year stand of him being the starting quarterback. He would complete 60% of his passes, which would be the lowest that he'd have as a starter for a very long time. I think that's actually looking back to 2003, that's actually the lowest the lowest completion percentage that he's ever had as a starting quarterback. He threw for 3,620 yards, his second consecutive season with at least 3,500 passing yards. He threw for 23 touchdowns and 12 picks. His third straight season with double-digit interceptions, but he was still doing what he needed to do. And once the Patriots made it into the playoffs, they would beat the Titans in the divisional round, a very great Titans team. This is also after the year that Belichick won Coach of the Year after they went 14-2. They would beat Peyton Manning and the Indianapolis Colts in the AFC Championship before they eventually beat Jake Delhomme and the Carolina Panthers in Super Bowl 38, which would be the Patriots' second Super Bowl in their franchise history. It will be Tom Brady's second Super Bowl as their starting quarterback in his third year starting in the league, and this would be Tom Brady's third Super Bowl title under his belt, and this was at the time where he had more Super Bowl MVPs than Pro Bowl appearances. So, of course, right then and there, his legacy was already cemented, and everything on top of that was just extra icing on the cake. And that was just following his third year in the league. Following that year, he would enter his age 27 year for the New England Patriots, his fourth full season as a starter in 2014. in 2004, I'm sorry. And in 2004, his age 27 season, he would start all 16 games for the third year in a row. And in this season, the New England Patriots would finish with a 14-2 record for the second straight year and win the AFC East. In this season, Tom Brady would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the second time in his career. And in this particular season, they would go on to, or just looking at how the Patriots fared this year, Tom Brady would go on to finish completing 60.8% of his completions, which is the second lowest at the time in a full season as a starter. He threw for 3,692 yards, the second most yards he'd ever thrown for. He threw for 28 touchdowns, which was tied for his career high, and he threw 14 interceptions, which was also a career high. He went on to finish the like I said, he finished the season with a second All-Star or a second Pro Bowl. And once they made the playoffs, they would beat Peyton Manning and the Colts in the first round. They would be Big Ben and the Steelers in the AFC Championship when Big Ben was setting the league on fire early on. And then they would end up beating the Philadelphia Eagles, led by Donovan McNabb and Terrell Owens in that Super Bowl, which would be Super Bowl 39. And Deion Branch will win Super Bowl MVP. And in his fourth season as a starting quarterback, and the only season he didn't make the Super Bowl was when when the Patriots completely missed it. But in his first three seasons in which he made the playoffs, he went all the way and took the team all the way to the championship. So by the end of his fourth full season as a starter, Tom Brady was a 3-time champion. Not to mention he was already a 2-time Pro Bowler at the time. Following that season, he would come back to New England for his age 28 season, and in that season, he would start 16 games for the fourth straight season, in a season where the New England Patriots would finish with a 10-6 record and still win the AFC East for the fourth time in a 5-year stretch. Tom Brady would be named a Pro Bowler for the third time in his career, and this time he would be named to the second team All-Pro, the first time that he made an All-Pro team as a quarterback. And in this season, in 2005, he did all this while leading the NFL in passing yards for the very first time in his career. He completed 63% of his passes, which was the second highest completion percentage he's had since his rookie season. He did all this while throwing 4,110 yards, the first time he eclipsed 4,000 yards passing. He also threw for 14 interceptions for the third time in his career, which was the last time that he's actually thrown this is the last season that he actually threw that many interceptions. And once the Patriots made the playoffs after Tom Brady was named a Pro Bowler for the third time in his career, they would beat the Jaguars in the wild card round before eventually losing to the Broncos in the divisional round. That was the year that Teddy Bruschi won the Comeback Player of the Year. And following Tom Brady's first playoff campaign in which he didn't win the Super Bowl, he would come back in 2006 for his age 29 season, which would effectively be his sixth season starting with the New England Patriots. And in 2006, he would go on to start all 16 games in a season where the Patriots finished with a 12-4 record, winning the AFC East for the fourth consecutive year and for the fifth time in his first 6 years as a starter. In that season, he would go on to complete 62% of his passes, throwing for 3,529 yards, throwing for 24 touchdowns and 12 picks. In a season where he did not officially make the Pro Bowl, but he would lead the Patriots to the playoffs yet again. And this year, they would go on to beat the Jets in the wild card round. They went on to beat the Chargers in the divisional round, and when the Chargers had LaDainian Tomlinson when he was at the peak of his powers, and then they would eventually lose in the AFC Championship to the Indianapolis Colts, who later on that year went on to beat the Chicago Bears in the Super Bowl to give Peyton Manning his first Super Bowl. But of course, Tom Brady was a big hurdle for the Colts to overcome that year in order to make the Super Bowl. Following that year, Tom Brady will come back to New England for his age 30 season, which may possibly go down as his best regular season to date. In his age 30 season, which at this point was his seventh year as the starter of the New England Patriots, He would start all 16 games in a season where the Patriots would finish with a 16-0 regular season record, the best regular season record that anyone had put up since the Miami Dolphins in the 70s. I forget exactly which year. I want to say 72, but this was the first time that anybody had done it in a 17-week season, in a 16-game season. That year, Belichick would go on to win the Coach of the Year. Tom Brady would win the MVP, and he would, of course, be named to the first team All-Pro for the very first time in his NFL career. In 2007, he will go on to complete 68.9% of his passes. He has that is the highest completion percentage that he's ever put together in a year. He threw for 4,806 yards, which would be the third most amount of passing yards that he's ever put together in a season, but that would be the second time in his NFL career he led the league in passing yards, and the only time he's led the NFL in completion percentage. He led the NFL with 50 touchdowns. That's the most touchdowns he's ever put together in a season, and he's only thrown at least 40 touchdowns twice. The first time was back then, and the second time was this most recent season. He threw his 50 touchdowns against 8 interceptions, and I guess to remember, this was also the year that he had Randy Moss as his number one go-to option. He would lead the league in touchdown percentage at 8.7. He led the league in yards per attempt, averaging 8.3 yards per attempt. He averaged 300 yards per game, and he had an 87 QBR. Once they made the playoffs, the Patriots would end up beating the Jaguars in the divisional round after they ended up with the first round bye. They ended up beating the Chargers in the AFC Championship before they ended up losing to Eli Manning, Michael Strahan, and the New York Giants in that Super Bowl, which would go down to be one of the biggest Super Bowl upsets of all time. That was Super Bowl 42. But of course, following that season, of course, that would be the regular season MVP. That would actually be the last accolade that I think Tom Brady really had to win for him to really have won it all. And despite the New England Patriots losing, Tom Brady would come back for 2008. But 2008 would be a season that was, of course, plagued with injury. He would be out due to a knee injury, and that would be the year where the New England Patriots let Jimmy Garoppolo start the entire season. In 2008, Tom Brady would only play one game, completing 7 of his 11 passes. And this would be a season where the Patriots would finish with an 11-5 record and still miss the playoffs. This would be the year that Gerard Mayo was named the Defensive Rookie of the Year. And surprising, with an 11-5 record, they missed it. But Tom Brady would come back in 2009 in his age 32 season and start all 16 games the next season, in a season where the Patriots would finish with a 10-6 record, and Tom Brady would win the Comeback Player of the Year. In 2009, Tom Brady would go on to be named to the Pro Bowl for the 9th time in his career, in his 8th season as a full-time starter for the New England Patriots. Also in 2009, in addition to being named the comeback, that's pretty much what happened. He'll be named the Comeback Player of the Year, and he would be named a Pro Bowler. They would go on to finish with the best record in the AFC East, as they went on to, this would be the 6th straight year where Tom Brady was the starting quarterback that they'd actually win the AFC East. In the season itself, he would go on to complete 65.7% of his passes, which except for the 2007 season, was the highest completion percentage he ever put together. He finished with 4,398 passing yards, which is the third time he ever eclipsed the 4,000-yard mark. He threw for 28 touchdowns alongside 13 interceptions, which up until then was the third time in his career he had put up 28 touchdowns. He did all of this while leading the Patriots to the playoffs, just for them to lose in the very first round to the Baltimore Ravens. And in 2009, this was the year where the Colts would end up winning the AFC, and they would lose to the New Orleans Saints. But after his very first year of coming back, winning another award in which he hadn't won up until that point, this would lead us into the 2010s, into the last decade of football. And in his age 33 season in 2010, he would start all 16 games for the New England Patriots in a season where they finished with a 14-2 record, and they would win the AFC East for the 7th straight season of Tom Brady starting at quarterback. In that season, Tom Brady would go on to complete 66% of his passes, though, for 3,900 yards. In a season where he led the league in passing touchdowns for the third time in his career. At that point, he threw for 36 touchdowns alongside 4 interceptions. He led the league in quarterback rating for the second time in his career, and same with ESPN QBR. He would go on to be named to the first team All-Pro for the second time in his career. And he would also win the Offensive Player of the Year for the second and most recent time of his career. And also he would win the MVP for the second time of his career as well. And at the conclusion of the season, the Patriots would end up losing in the very first round to the Jets. And this would also be the third time in which Bill Belichick had won the Coach of the Year. And this would be his 11th year with the team, to give a sense of how well they were playing. Following that season in which they would lose in the first round, Tom Brady would bring the Patriots back to the Super Bowl again in his age 34 season in 2011. In this season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the New England Patriots would go 13-3 and win the AFC East yet again. In the regular season, Tom Brady would be named a Pro Bowler, which at this point would end up... No, this would be the 7th time that he had officially been named to the Pro Bowl. This is just doing the math at this point is actually kind of ridiculous, but it would just continuing on into the year that he had. He would complete 65.6% of his passes, doing roughly what he did before, throwing at least 100 more passes than before. He would throw for 5,235 yards, which would be the career high, the most passes that he'd ever throw in a season in his career. He did all this while throwing for 39 touchdowns, the third most touchdowns he's ever thrown in a season in his career, alongside 12 interceptions. He would also throw the longest pass of the year. He threw a 99-yard pass, which would be the longest pass of his regular season career. And following his second MVP season, once the Patriots made the playoffs, they would beat the Broncos in the first round. They would beat the Ravens in the AFC Championship, and then they would end up losing to the Giants for the second time in a Super Bowl. Though that would be the only team that Tom Brady has actually lost to, and that would be his second Super Bowl appearance since his third Super Bowl win in 2004. To give a little bit more context, but regardless. Following that season, he would come back to New England in 2012 for what would be his 11th full season as a starter. And in that season, he would start all 16 games for a New England Patriots team that would finish 12-4 and would go on to win the AFC East for yet another season. In that regular season, Tom Brady in 2012 would be named a Pro Bowler for, at this point, would go on. This would be the 4th season in a row since his comeback, and this would be the 8th time that he had officially been named a Pro Bowler in his career. He completed 63% of his passes, throwing for 4,827 yards. This would be the second season he threw for at least 4,500 yards. This would be the 5th season in his NFL career where he threw at least 4,000 yards, throwing for 34 touchdowns alongside 8 interceptions. This would be the second time in his career he had the lowest interception percentage in the league. And once they made the playoffs, they would beat the Texans in the first round before losing to the Ravens in the AFC Championship. And this would go on to be the year that the Ravens ended up beating the San Francisco 49ers, just to show how competitive the New England Patriots were, especially at that time. Following that season in which they lost to the Ravens, he would come back for his age 36 season. And in his age 36 season, which would be his 12th season in the league, Tom Brady would go on to be named a Pro Bowler for the 9th time in his career. In his age 36 season, this would be his 5th straight season of being named a Pro Bowler. He would go on to help the Patriots finish with a 12-4 record after starting all 16 games. And in this season, they would go on to win the AFC North for what would be the 5th straight year. The only year in which they didn't was the year that he was hurt. And this would be the second straight 5-peat in which the New England Patriots had won the AFC East. Like I said, the only break being the year that he was injured. In 2013, he would go on to complete 60.5% of his passes. That would be the lowest completion percentage that he'd had since his 2003 season, the year that he didn't win the the year in which Tom Brady would win his second Super Bowl, but he would complete 60.5% of his passes, throwing for 4,343 yards, throwing for 25 touchdowns, which is the lowest amount of touchdowns he's had since 2006 or his injured season, alongside 11 interceptions. And once the Patriots made the playoffs, they would beat the Colts and Peyton Manning in the first round. They not with Colts. They beat the Colts starring Andrew Luck in the divisional round before they ended up losing to the Indianapolis Colts in the AFC Championship, before the Indianapolis Colts ended up losing to the Seahawks when Peyton Manning was putting together his virtuoso season. But once after the Patriots did not make the playoffs, they would come back in 2014 for Tom Brady's age 37 season. And in that season, Tom Brady would go on to make the playoffs yet again after starting all 16 games and helping the Patriots finish with a 12-4 record for the third season in a row. And this would be yet another season where Tom Brady would make the Pro Bowl. At this point, this would be his sixth straight Pro Bowl appearance, his seventh in the previous 8 years. And this would be his 10th Pro Bowl appearance in his NFL career. He would go on to complete 64% of his passes, throwing for 4,109 yards. And once again, in 2014, this would be a season where they would find themselves going right back, or they would find themselves being contenders, making it right back to the Super Bowl. And right before they made the Super Bowl, Tom Brady would finish with 39 touchdowns and 9 interceptions. Not to mention that once they made the playoffs, they would beat the Ravens in the divisional round. They would beat the Colts 45-7 in the AFC Championship before they ended up beating the Seahawks in Super Bowl 49. That was the Super Bowl in which Marshawn Lynch could have just run it in from the 1-yard line, but Malcolm Butler's interception on Russell Wilson in the end zone would end up giving Tom Brady his fourth championship. His first championship since 2004, which was actually 10 years prior. After Rob Gronkowski won the Comeback Player of the Year award, Tom Brady would take home his third Super Bowl MVP and what would be his fourth championship in 2014, which would, of course, be yet another trophy that was added to his collection. Following his 2014 season, he would come back in 2015, which would be his age 38 season. And in that season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Patriots would win. They would go 12-14 again, 12-4 again. This would be the fourth season in a row in which they did so. Tom Brady will go on to be named a Pro Bowler in what will be the 7th straight year of his career, for the 11th time in what will be his 14-year career as a starter. He will go on to complete 64% of his passes, throwing for 4,770 yards. At this point, this would be the 5th straight season he threw for at least 4,000 yards. This would be the 8th season in his career in which he had done so. He led the league in passing touchdowns with 36. This would be the 4th and the last time that he has done so in recent memory in his career. Through 7 interceptions, he had the lowest interception percentage for the 3rd time in his career. And at the conclusion of the season, he would not be named to an all-NFL team. But like I said, after being named a Pro Bowler, the Patriots would go on to beat the Chiefs in the divisional round when the Chiefs had Alex Smith. And then they would end up losing in the AFC Championship to the Denver Broncos right before the Denver Broncos, I believe, took it all that year. And that was when Von Miller won the Super Bowl MVP after they beat the Carolina Panthers. Following that season, Tom Brady would come back for his 2016 season, a season where he only played 12 games. And in that season, he would finish with an 11-1 record in the 12 games he played, in a season where the New England Patriots finished with a 12-4 record. They finished with a 14-2 record in the games that they played. And in that regular season, Tom Brady would complete 67% of his passes, which would be the 2nd highest completion percentage he'd ever have in his career. He threw for 3,554 yards, even though it was a shortened season. This would be the first season since 2010 in which he didn't throw for 4,000 yards. He had his best interception percentage, or he had his best ratio of touchdowns to interceptions that year, as he threw 28 touchdowns against 2 interceptions. Once they made it to the playoffs, they would eventually go on to beat the Texans in the divisional round 34-16. They would beat the Steelers in the AFC Championship by 19, and then they would eventually come back from being down 28-3 to beat the Atlanta Falcons in overtime in Super Bowl 51. Tom Brady will go on to be named the Super Bowl MVP for the fourth time, and he will go on to win his fifth Super Bowl. And yeah, he would go on to beat the regular season MVP from that year, Matt Ryan and the Atlanta Falcons, and would probably go down as one of the greatest Super Bowl performances of all time. And not to mention that in 2016, Tom Brady was named to the second team All-Pro after a virtuoso season. And following his fifth Super Bowl, he would come back to New England for his age 40 season. In his age 40 season in 2017, he will go on to start all 16 games in a season where the Patriots would finish with a 13-3 record. They would win the AFC East yet again, and at this point, this would go on to be the 9th season in a row in which they had done so. In the regular season, Tom Brady led the league in passing attempts for the only time in his career. He completed 66% of his passes, throwing for 4,577 yards. This is the third time in his career he had led the league in passing yards, and yet another season in which he threw for at least 4,500 yards. He threw for 32 touchdowns against 8 interceptions, and he led the league in yards per game for the second time in his career. The only other time that he did so was in 2007. In 2017, he would go down as the NFL MVP for the third time in his career. He has not won the regular season MVP since 2007. He was named to the first team All-Pro. He has not been named to the first team All-Cents. He has not led the league in passing yards either. And at the conclusion of the season, he would take the Patriots past the Titans in the divisional round. They would go on to beat the Jaguars in the AFC Championship, and then they would end up losing Super Bowl 52 to the Eagles after Brady he became the oldest player in NFL history to, I believe, win the NFL MVP. But following that season in which they finished up short, they would come back in 2018 and show that they were right back in that they were ready to get right back in there. In 2018, in Tom Brady's age 41 season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Patriots would go on to finish with an 11-5 record. They would win the AFC East. Up until then will be a 10 for the 10th straight year, which would be Tom Brady's 15th straight year of being a starting quarterback in that division and winning the division. In the regular season itself, Tom Brady would go on to, of course, be named a Pro Bowler for what up until then was the 10th straight season he was named a Pro Bowler. He was named a Pro Bowler for the 14th year in his career, and he has actually not been named a Pro Bowler since. In 2018, he would complete 65.8% of his passes, throwing for 4,355 yards. He threw for 29 touchdowns against 11 interceptions. And in his very last season of being a Pro Bowler, he would help the Patriots beat the Chargers in the divisional rounds. They would beat the Chiefs in the AFC Championship in overtime thanks to a coin toss virtually. And then they would win Super Bowl 53 in Atlanta against the Los Angeles Rams. This would be the first time that the Rams had made the Super Bowl as a Los Angeles team again. And in this year, Julian Edelman would win the Super Bowl MVP. And at the conclusion of this game, Tom Brady would help the New England Patriots tie the Pittsburgh Steelers for the franchise with the most Super Bowl wins, and they had won all 6 of those championships with Tom Brady as the starting quarterback. And following that year, he would come back to what would be his final season in New England in 2019. In his age 42 season, he would start all 16 games for a Patriots team that would go 12-4, and that would end their 11-year stretch of winning the AFC East in straight seasons. This would be his 16th straight season of being a starting quarterback for the Patriots and leading them to the playoffs. In the regular season, he would complete 60.8% of his passes. That would be the lowest completion percentage that he'd have as a starting quarterback since his age 36 season in 2013. He would throw for 4,057 yards. Yet another season he threw for over 4,000 yards. He threw for 24 touchdowns alongside 8 interceptions. in a season that where he didn't really have all the options around him in New England to the point where he left the team. But at the conclusion of the season, they would end up losing to the Titans in the very first round in the year that Stephon Gilmore was named the Defensive Player of the Year. And following the 2019 season, Tom Brady was no longer a member of the New England Patriots. And in 2020, he would go on to sign a one-year deal with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a season that many people are aware of that was affected by COVID to the point where there were no fans in the stands, and they allowed the first fans in during the playoffs. But in his very first season with Tampa Bay, Tom Brady would completely flip the script, and in his only season thus far with Tampa Bay, he would go on to start all 16 games in the season where the Buccaneers would finish with an 11-5 record. They would finish with the second best record in the NFC South, as the only team that beat Tom Brady twice in a season was the New Orleans Saints this past year. And Tom Brady will go on to lead the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to the playoffs despite not being named a Pro Bowler. He would complete 65.7% of his passes, throwing for 4,633 yards, the most passing yards he's thrown in a season since 2015. He would throw for 40 touchdowns, the most touchdowns he's thrown in a season since 2007, where he threw for 50. He threw for 12 interceptions as well, and he would help the Buccaneers make it to the playoffs, where they would beat the then Washington football team in the very first round. They would beat the Saints in the divisional playoff round after they enter the fourth quarter, tied up at 20. The Buccaneers would break away from there. They would beat the Packers in Green Bay by 5. They won 31-26, and then they would end up winning Super Bowl 55 against the Kansas City Chiefs. Tom Brady would go on to win his 5th Super Bowl MVP, and he would go on to win his 7th Super Bowl title. And this is all one player. Even though football is a team sport, this man was a part of so many championship runs. This would be also his 16th season in which he led a team to the playoffs as a starting quarterback. In his 16 years in which he's led the team to the playoffs, he's led that team to the Super Bowl itself a total of... No, yeah, he led the team to the Super Bowl itself a total of 10 times. He won 7 times, 6 times with the New England Patriots and 1 with the Buccaneers, and he lost twice. He lost twice to the New York Giants, and then he did lose to the Philadelphia Eagles. And that is the cherished and storied career of Tom Brady. From the beginning to where he is right now as he turns 44, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, football player to ever touch a football. The 199th overall pick from the 2000 NFL Draft is continuing to make a name for himself, and it is very possible that he could lead the Buccaneers to a back-to-back title. And there are few players that I actually have this much faith in, despite him being well into his 40s, after putting together possibly one of the greatest decades of football, even in his 30s. I mean, you can really take any section of Tom Brady's career and put it against any best stretch of any other quarterback, and Tom Brady's would still probably be more impressive. But with that said, that leads us to where we are now. But I want to thank Football Reference, College Football Reference. I want to thank the NFL website, ESPN, for giving me the facts and figures that I needed in order to do this episode. I want to thank everyone for listening to all 38 minutes of this piece. I want to wish Tom Brady a happy birthday, and if you ever get a chance to watch him, he wears number 12 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the moment. He is 44 years old, and he has all the rest of the NFL virtually shaking in their boots. Not to mention that with Drew Brees retired, he's more than likely going to run away, or by the time he retires, he will run away with the career passing yards, passing touchdowns, records, and until someone else comes by and takes them off, he will have those records as well. So just talking about the longevity, the excellence, the persistence, the consistency, all of that comes together to make what might possibly be one of the greatest competitors in the history of football, Tom Brady. Thanks once again for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and hopefully by this time next year, I'll have more to talk about with Tom Brady. And once again, today is Tuesday, August 3rd, 2021. Thanks again for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and I hope to catch you again next year. So peace out. Thanks for listening to my piece, and I'll catch you next year, especially when it comes to Tom Brady, a player who's not just elite, he's a GOAT.